Presenter today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Zed Sevcikova-Sehyr. Zed leads the Cognition, Language and Plasticity Lab at Chapman University, where she is an assistant professor. Zed completed her PhD at University College London, and she was looking in that work, she was looking at handling handshapes in BSL. And from there, she jumped across the Atlantic to another sign language and another lab. She went to Karen Emery's Laboratory for Language, Cognition and Neuroscience. And she spent a very productive 10 years there. And Zed's work looks at visual language processing, both in terms of sign language and also reading, and how our experience, either as deaf individuals or as hearing individuals, or as experience with sign language or without sign language, can impact how we represent language. So Zed was one of the people behind the creation of the ASL Lex database. And today she'll be presenting an extension of that work, which is the free association norms collected for ASL. So Zed, it's a real pleasure, and I think very fitting that you're the first speaker for this Signing Mind seminar series. So thank you very much for agreeing to this talk, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Brendan. That was a great introduction. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So let me just share my slides and hope this works. Again, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. This is it's so great to share this work with you. Today I'll be presenting from a large-scale project that focuses on semantic networks in American Sign Language. And this project really provides the first comprehensive analysis of ASL semantic associations, and also offers some comparisons with spoken languages. And before I start, in this talk, I will focus a little bit more deeply on some of the analyses and new results that we have. But I will give a little bit of a background to those perhaps who are new to this topic. But first of all, I would like to introduce the rest of the team because this is by no means a sole effort. A lot of people were involved in this project to make it happen. So teams across, I think, 4 universities actually collaborated on this so far, consisting of both deaf and hearing scientists. The project involves myself, Karen Emery, and Cindy Farnady at SDSU, and now Chapman, Naomi Caselli, and Alana Pontecorvo at Boston University, Ariel Cohen-Goldberg at Tufts, and now a latest member of our team is Erin Buchanan at Harrisburg. And this project would not be possible without the help from the Boston University Software and Innovation Lab, SAIL Lab, who helped with the technical aspects of this project. The data was collected during the pandemic, so this shows you how long this project has been coming. And so they helped us build the platform for the data collection and tagging that I'll be describing a little bit today. And also, most importantly, I wanted to acknowledge the valuable time that all the deaf participants gave us to help us make this project happen. So without them, this project, of course, would not be possible. So I'm going to also start by saying that this project is not, the data has not been published. So this is really kind of the first preview of some of the findings. So I do apologize if anything isn't quite as rehearsed as it should be at this time, but we should hopefully have a publication on the way soon. So I'm going to begin with some motivations for the study. I'll give a little bit of a background to semantic networks and the kind of structure of networks that has been observed in spoken languages. I'll introduce briefly the study goals, Then I'll talk about the methods and some of the models that we used to analyze semantic structure in a sign language. And then I'll present you two sets of analyses. I think that's all we're going to have time for today. And I'll conclude with some theoretical implications for this project. So let me start with a simple but powerful observation. Language users retrieve words or concepts incredibly fast, in the order of 100 times per minute. So this fluency suggests that our mental lexicon isn't just a massive list of words, but it's a highly structured system, optimized for speed and lexical access. So here's the big question. How is the mental lexicon organized? And there are many ways that we organize our words and signs in our mind. For example, by lexical frequency, grammatical class, word length, and so on, or phonological form. But one particular powerful dimension of this organization is meaning, and how words relate to one another conceptually. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on this semantic organization and how do people organize their knowledge in terms of meaning in their mind. And understanding this really has implications not just for basic linguistic theory, but also for language development, language disorders like aphasia, and even how language is stored and accessed in bilingual users. So here is where it gets really interesting, is how is the sign language lexicon organized? So while most work has been done on spoken languages, sign languages really give us this unique opportunity to ask whether a visual manual lexicon is organized in the same way as has been found for spoken languages. So do deaf signers structure their semantic lexicons like speakers do? Or does it change, does modality change fundamentally how meanings are linked? So how do we actually retrieve concepts so quickly in real time? One way to answer this is to think of the mental lexicon as in terms of semantic network, in terms of concepts that are interconnected in a network-like structure, where nodes represent the meanings and edges represent the associative connections. And these edges vary in strength, so some connections are tighter and more frequently activated, while others are more loose and distant. So for example, the concept mind might activate nearby concepts like idea or brain first, with activation then spreading more weakly to related ideas like head and soul. And this spreading activation captures a lot of what we know about language use. So how we can jump from one idea to another, how priming works, or how we retrieve related words when speaking or signing or listening. So semantic networks don't just model how words are related, but they model how meaning moves through the system fast and dynamically. So our mental lexicon stores thousands, if not tens of thousands of concepts. And one of the most reliable way to tap into how those concepts are organized is through a free semantic association task. So here in this task, people are given a cue word or sign, like mind, and asked to generate concepts that readily come to their mind, like head and brain and so on. And we know based on decades of psycholinguistic research that responses that are strongly associated come up faster and more frequently than the weaker ones. So this gives us not just the list of association, but a kind of a map of conceptual proximity. So when we look at these maps across a whole language, a clear pattern emerges. So we know, based on research, that these networks are organized into what we call small world networks. So what is a small world? So it basically means that concepts are not only a few steps apart, but that they're also tightly clustered. They kind of form these tightly knit neighborhoods of meaning. And this small wall structure is thought to balance efficiency and flexibility, making it easy to find what you're looking for, and keeping related ideas close by. So how do we determine small world structures? There are really the key three key metrics that I will especially focus on today. We'll focus on clustering coefficients. We'll focus on path length, so how many hops it takes to move across the lexicon, and modularity. So the clustering coefficient tells us how interconnected concepts and their neighbors are. So how tightly knit the communities are. And high values here suggest that concepts are well interconnected, that they're tightly knit, and they're like small communities of related ideas. So like people who share lots of interests and always hang out together. The average, the shortest path length tells us something about access. So shorter path means faster access to connected ideas or neighbors. So the shorter the path, the less distance required to travel the network. And then thirdly, modularity values tell us something about how strongly the separate communities are connected to one another. So how strongly the network separates into these communities or cliques. So high modularity here would mean that network has tightly knit clusters with few links between them. And so this can kind of help with topic-specific retrieval, but may limit cross connections. So taken together, these metrics give us a measure of the efficiency and cohesion and the structure of the semantic lexicon. And when we apply these metrics to data of spoken languages like English or Dutch or Hebrew, we can actually see some consistent patterns emerging. So basically these would be higher clustering coefficients, short average path lengths, and kind of moderate modularity. So which suggests kind of more integrative rather than fragmented structures.
Sí, era algo que me hacía y gracias a la Madre de Dios, no nos da nada.
All right, so more importantly, when real language networks are compared to random networks, where connections are assigned without regard to meaning, for example, spoken language networks look very different. They are more efficient, more clustered, and more semantically coherent, reinforcing the idea that this lexical organization isn't just accidental, that it's cognitively functional. And so these cross-linguistic patterns suggest that that we find across many different spoken languages that shared principles may be guiding this how people structure their lexicons. But this also raises the key question that we address today is, does the same structure emerge in sign language lexicons, where modality may actually represent kind of unique differences? And the reason I say that is that we have emerging evidence now that there may be some modality specific differences between signed and spoken lexicons. But really, despite the fact that so much work has been done on spoken languages, we still know surprisingly little about how signers organize these structures on a lexicon-wide scale. We know that, for example, in ASL or in sign languages like American Sign Language, the sign form closely resembles its meaning. And so kind of this makes sign languages a really valuable test case for these to test out these small world structures and to see whether they hold across modalities. There's actually very few studies have looked at these kind of alignments across a whole lexicon. But we do know that some recent research actually challenges this idea that the relationship between the relationship between form and meaning is arbitrary. And we're finding that really this is much less the case in sign languages. So for example, in ASL, many signs are iconic. They resemble concepts they represent. And there is now growing evidence that these may be systematically, this resemblance may be systematically reorganizing the lexicon. For example, signs related to emotion like tired and happy or angry tend to be produced on or near the chest, and location isn't random. It's iconically reflecting where we physically experience these emotions. And these phenomenon where multiple signs share semantic category and phonological features like location is called systematicity. And it suggests that the ASL lexicon may be shaped by not just individual iconic signs, but in fact structured by patterns of sort of these meaning to form mappings. In a very recent study, which I will not be talking about in depth today, but I did want to mention it because it's a very cool study, and the paper has actually just come out. So in PNAS, you can read it. But I will very briefly mention this, that indeed in this project led by Erin Campbell, we examined this idea of systematicity in the ASL lexicon using this bottom-up approach, data-driven approach. And we combined the semantic similarity data from the project that I will be describing today from the semantic associations and phonological similarity across signs using values from the ASLX database. And when we compare and iconicity ratings, and when we compare these patterns, basically also with other spoken languages like English and Spanish. And what we found in this study was really interesting. We found that words that are semantically closer to one another also tend to be more similar in form. And this is something that's been found in other studies already. But critically, in ASL, we found that this form-meaning relationship was stronger, particularly stronger when the signs were rated high for iconicity. So it seems that this iconicity seems to amplify this alignment between form and meaning, especially in ASL. This was not the case necessarily for Spanish. Okay, so moving on to the questions of this presentation. So we ask whether ASL, American Sign Language, exhibits small world structures. And we do this by comparing ASL networks to randomized networks. And then the second set of analysis I'll mention today is how might modality shape structure. And for this, we compared ASL networks with data from English. And very briefly, the goals of the study were to gather sign semantic associations in ASL, to develop a video-based data collection and tagging platform that allows us to deal with video-based data. Using tools from network science, we then constructed semantic networks and to characterize the structure for ASL and compared this with English networks. We recruited a group of 45 Deaf ASL signers to participate in the study. And we conducted a free semantic association task. For this task, we started with the 2,723 Q signs from the ASLX database. And for each Q, participants produced 3 signs that were related in meaning. And I'm going to show you how this task worked. So participants signed in to a platform. This data was collected entirely online. So participants signed in, saw a video of an ASLQ sign that was randomly selected from the ASLX, and produced conceptual 3 signs that that popped into their mind. And each response was recorded separately using a webcam through this interface. And to ensure smooth and accurate data collection, participants followed a protocol. They were asked to keep their hands at rest when not signing, and used a mouse click to start and stop the recordings. And then a green light indicated when the camera was on and recording. Participants could submit fewer than 3 responses if they couldn't think of 3. And they could also opt to withdraw a response, but they could not go back and re-record their responses. And then once they submitted their responses, they moved on to the next Q sign. And on the other side, this platform also was developed to allow us for a kind of fast data, video data tagging. And this is the truly innovative part of this project, is to kind of speed up the process of tagging, systematic tagging of signed responses. So this system basically allowed us to tag the ASL responses with ASL, and bypassing this need for translations or extensive glossing for responses. So how this worked was that a trained team of coders logged into the tagging platform. For each trial, they saw a participant's response video, and then they saw a drop-down menu on the right, and they basically selected the sign that matched the participant's response from using glosses from ASLX. And basically, if the response was not located or cataloged in ASLX, it was manually tagged or tagged with a gloss from the ASL sign bank and tabled for later analyses. So in the networks that I will talk about today, we only included signs that were actually in ASLX. And of course, as you can imagine, many decisions had to be made about what counts as a match. So during this tagging process, so here's just a very simplified decision chart. For example, when a participant produced a sign that was phonologically similar to the sign in ASLX, like the sign for paint produced with a two-hand shape as opposed to four-hand shape, this was still considered a match. But if the sign was phonologically too different, even if the meaning was related, like child and kid, this was not considered a match. And these kinds of decisions were critical for preserving the structural accuracy of the resulting semantic networks. Then we needed to prep the data. So once the data was tagged, and we basically ran it through a little bit of a cleaning process. And I'd be very happy to discuss this later, but just for the sake of brevity, I will just kind of show you a visual of the process that we applied to prepare the data for analyses. So from this, from the 2,700 Q signs that were randomly sampled from ASLX, and collecting free semantic association from 45 signers, each sign received about 15 responses, 15 associations from each signer. And we then automatically filtered signs that were either too short or too long. And we ended up with over 100K of Q response pairs associated in the task. And then a bunch of responses were further excluded from this data. For example, responses that were not valid, that were too short or too long. The taggers did not recognize the sign, or the sign was not clear. And then there were other responses that were tagged as don't know. Overall, what we ended up with was about 65,000 responses that were tagged with ASLX gloss and included in our network analysis. And then we had 2,715 unique signs in this data set, and there were as many as 30,156 unique Q response pairs. All right. Moving on to the results. So first I'm going to show you just a very kind of very basic descriptive take on the lexicon. Here I'm showing you some of the most commonly associated pairs. We can see that some of the most common key pairs tended to be semantically prototypical. For example, keys like number elicited one, flower elicited rose, and so on. These associations really reflect core categories and basic level concepts that are rooted in everyday experiences. Many of these signs tended to cluster around basic needs and common activities. And that kind of aligns with what we've seen in semantic norms in spoken languages as well, suggesting shared conceptual properties in the structure, even across modalities. The next analysis I'll present is our first analysis, really first dip into the associative network models. And here, I'm just going to talk a little bit about terminology. So what we did was we used concepts as nodes, and the connections between them formed edges in these networks. And how did we construct the edges? So the edges basically were a reflection of this associative strength between cue and response. And these values were the conditional probability of a response being given to a cue. So for example, the likelihood that someone will respond with knock to the cue sign door. And so this is often referred to as forward strength. So if this pair was associated many times, the strength, the edge strength was higher than if the pair was only associated once. Like knock and door was associated 10 times, but door and knock was only associated once. And we also refer to these one-time associations as singletons. And this will be important when I talk about the two different network models that we constructed. Okay, so we computed also a value that allows us to compare this probability of two concepts co-occurring together called pointwise mutual information. And this value was normalized, fit between -1 and 1. And so these values help us identify meaningful relationships that really go beyond just frequency-based estimates of closeness. And again, a little bit more technicalities before I show you some of the results. What we did was we constructed two different types of models where we constructed a full network model and a model that actually went on to exclude the one-time associates, the singletons. And so we refer to this as the full model versus the reduced model. And then secondly, we evaluated whether the structure of these networks actually reflects meaningful semantic organization. And these cue response pairings were basically reshuffled to create a randomized network that we then compared the real network structure to. And essentially, basically, we ended up with distributions for each of these core metrics. So again, these core metrics that I will focus on today were clustering, path length, and modularity. So here is the result for the clustering coefficient. So in red, I'm showing you the full network, and in blue, I'm showing you the reduced network. And here, what you can see is the distribution for the clustering coefficient. And you can see that in the full network, the clustering coefficient was a little bit lower than in the reduced network. So removing the singletons actually increased the clustering very slightly. But then, is this different from random networks? And it appears that when we reshuffle the networks to create a random networks, we do see that actually the clustering is lower in the real networks than in the random networks, than would be expected by chance. When we look at the average shortest path length, again, we see that it is in the reduced model, the path length was slightly longer than it was actually much longer than in the full model. So again, the full model includes the singletons, whereas the reduced model doesn't. And so removing these singleton connections actually increases the number of hops that are required to traverse the lexicon. And again, a comparison against random networks suggests that actually fewer hops are required than in random networks. So the real ASL network includes shorter path lengths, so kind of a better connectivity. And finally, modularity results show that the modularity was consistently higher. Again, I'm showing the full networks in red reduced networks in blue, and then the random networks are shown as triangles. And the modularity was consistently higher in the reduced networks. So in practical terms, this means that signs in ASL tend to group well into well-defined neighborhoods, like the cliques, and perhaps reflecting a more sort of thematic domains, but don't really connect as broadly across the different domains or different other neighborhoods, which we see in spoken languages. Okay. So just to quickly summarize, I do want to get to our ASL English comparison. So ASL networks tend to have small world characteristics, but with greater sparsity than random networks. What we see is lower clustering compared to random networks. We see short average path lengths, and we see higher modularity, suggesting that there's more segregated or compartmentalized structure. So moving on to our second set of analysis, and that's all I present for today. So what we were interested is kind of comparing sign and spoken language lexicons to see if there are any kind of interesting modality specific differences. So here we estimated the same network properties for ASL. But then now we also compared these two data from spoken English, the small world of words norms, focusing again on the three network metrics. For this, we had to do a lot of kind of data alignment, because naturally the English lexicons are much larger than the ASL lexicons. So the ASL glosses were actually matched to English entries via lexical translation. We had to do, there was a lot of manual adjustments had to be made for spelling, contractions, or multiple meanings. And all in all, I think we ended up with about 64 signs that went unmatched to English entries. And here again, we constructed two different data sets. These are slightly different than the ones that I described earlier. Here again, in terms of matching the data sets, we constructed a model where the cues overlapped between ASL and English. So as long as the cues overlapped, it was considered a match. So we called this the ASL cue, the cue matched models. But then we also built a slightly more stricter match where both cue and response had to overlap between the ASL and English lexicons. So this was just a little bit more tightly controlled data set. And this way we made sure that these data sets were conceptually overlapping. And additionally, these models were also resampled to match for sample size. So again, naturally, some concepts in ASL had way more responses than the concepts in ASL. So this kind of resampling ensured that our data sets were actually matched on sample size. And this was important because, this kind of helped us normalize these data sets to ensure that differences we see arise due to modality differences and not necessarily from differences in response density or lexical coverage. And I'm whizzing through this presentation because I believe I may be soon running out of time. So again, focusing on the major three network statistics. So first, I'm going to show you the results for the clustering coefficients. And here on in the left panel, I'm showing you the results from the Q-matched, less tightly controlled data set. And on the right-hand side, it's the Q-response match, the more tightly controlled data set, or overlap between English and ASL. English here is plotted in blue, and then ASL is plotted in red. And what we see here is that in the Q-matched models on the left, ASL actually shows higher clustering coefficient than English. And this seems to suggest that there's stronger local clustering among signs. However, in the kind of greater in the data set with greater overlap, this pattern reverses. So the clustering coefficient is actually smaller in ASL than English, and it kind of aligns with what we've seen so far. And not quite clear as to why this reversal happens here. It may be that it's an effect of the filtering process, that maybe it kind of restricting English to only entries that overlap with ASL kind of removes the looser associations and leave in the data set only the tighter, more connected clusters. But interestingly, and I think what's really important here is that the ASL network appears to maintain its clustering in both models. So the clustering coefficient doesn't really change much, regardless of whether we leave the loose connections in the data set. So it perhaps points to a more kind of semantic coherence in ASL. Switching to path length, what we see here is, again, the Q matched on the left, Q response matched on the right. And in blue, English, we see that the average path length is shorter in ASL, and that is regardless of how we model the network or how we match the data sets. And so this is rather clear pattern. It shows that in English consistently kind of requires fewer hops to get from to connect to any cues in the lexicon. And it suggests that English concepts may be more densely interconnected overall than ASL. And this may reflect a greater lexical density in English norms compared to sign, potentially pointing to some modality specific ways in how meanings are reorganized in sign lexicons. And then thirdly, I want to mention the modularity. Again, that tells us about how interconnected the communities are across the lexicon. And here the pattern is also somewhat clear. Higher modularity in signed lexicon than in the spoken lexicon. Again, aligning with what I reported previously, suggesting that concepts, the ASL lexicons tend to be more segmented or perhaps more compartmentalized. It has a more compartmentalized community structure. And it could imply again that there may be that the concepts that cluster together locally in English, in concepts that cluster more locally in ASL may actually have fewer connecting bridges to other networks. All right, so very quickly summarizing this results. So ASL shows overall sparser connectivity, longer path lengths, and a greater degree of modularity, which suggests that ASL lexicons are well interconnected, but more compartmentalized with more distinct semantic neighborhoods. But despite these structural differences that we find between English and ASL, we still see that both languages exhibit small world properties, and we confirm that by comparison to randomized networks. And this indicates that the similar key principles govern semantic organization across the two different modalities. Supporting that both languages, the lexicons in both languages are optimized for fast retrieval and efficient organization. I will skip this very quickly. This was just to tell you that there was a slightly different models that we also looked at, the conceptual kind of similarity across the network. And I will skip this for the sake of time, but if anybody's interested in what else did you do, I'd be happy to come back to this. But I do want to also very briefly talk about kind of another analyses that we looked at. So of course, once we've collected and estimated all these semantic relatedness measures, we were also interested to see how this kind of semantic density measures relate to other variables in ASL, like phonological similarity or iconicity or lexical frequency. And so for the semantic density, we calculated multiple different measures. But here I will just very briefly mention a measure of semantic density, which was calculated as it's a strength weighted measure that uses the pointwise mutual information to quantify how strongly connected a sign is to its neighbors. And we also estimated the semantic diversity in responses. So looking at all the different, the diversity of responses that participants gave to the different Q signs using the Shannon entropy, the H index. And that kind of gave us an idea of the richness and the dispersion, the semantic dispersion of the responses. And then, of course, ASLX contains information about the lexical properties of these signs, like frequency and iconicity, and semantic and phonological neighborhood density. And we ran correlational analyses among these variables. So correlating semantic similarity with phonological similarity, frequency, and so on. And what we see here, showing you a heat map of plotting all the different correlations, the significance values. So of course, the darker color signifies stronger correlation between variables. And then just kind of zooming on the semantic neighborhood density and semantic diversity variables. Of course, what we see, unsurprisingly, that all the semantic density measures were positively correlated with each other, showing a good internal consistency in how semantic connectivity is distributed across the lexicon. And replicating prior work, also we see positive correlation between semantics and phonology. So showing that phonologically similar signs also tend to have higher association density and diversity. So this replicates existing work already. What we see also is that frequent signs had higher association density, appearing in more semantic neighborhoods or occupying more central spaces in the positions in the networks. But we did not see a strong correlation between the semantic density measures and iconicity. Here specifically, what we did see, though, was that iconic signs, there was a negative correlation between iconicity and the diversity index. And what I think this may suggest that iconic signs tend to have less diverse semantic breadth, associative breadth, perhaps attracting more specifically specific semantic meanings more systematically, which would align with the study on systematicity in ASL lexicon. But I think it's time for me to really conclude and bring this to the end so that we can open up for questions. So this was what I've presented today was really the first large-scale semantic network analyses for ASL. And what we saw, I think we saw both universal and modality-specific features of semantic organization. In ASL, both ASL and English showed small word properties, which are optimized to support lexical retrieval. So both languages regardless modality. But also, we did see some modality-specific differences. So for example, ASL networks were sparser and more modular than English networks. And this means that possibly sign language networks are optimized for modality-specific demands and may be shaped by other organizing principles like iconicity. And really, this data set offers a platform or a kind of springboard for future research in linguistics and cognitive science, examining kind of how concepts are organized in the signing mind. And a couple of theoretical implication, really, this work calls for modality-inclusive models of the mental lexicon, highlight the need for modality-sensitive theories of semantic memory, and also suggest that organization of meaning is shaped by the visual manual affordances of sign languages. So I'll wrap up and open the floor for questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Great talk, Zed. So one of the problems with giving online talks is that you finish and there's just a deadly silence. So I'm gonna I'm gonna be your clapping. Thank you for that that excellent presentation. So we'll pass on now to the question and answer session. As I'll just remind you that we're running slightly over time, but we've got some time for questions. So we're using the question and answer function in Zoom. So you can access that using the button at the bottom of the screen. If you can't see that, you might need to click a button that says, got 3 dots that says more. And you can either just flag that you want to ask a question by typing sign or English in the question and answer box, or you can type out the question in full and ask me to read it out, and I'll happily do that. So I just want to remind you that this session is being recorded. So if you don't want to appear in the recording, please make sure you keep your camera off. Right, so I see that we've already had a couple of questions. Matt Dye has already stolen a question that I had. Matt, do you want to ask that question yourself, or do you want me to just read it out very quickly? Okay, so Matt would like to know whether the size of the lexicon influences things. So he's assuming that English has a much larger lexicon than ASL. So does the fact that ASL has a smaller lexicon, could that be driving some of the effects that you have observed rather than perhaps pure modality differences?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Matt. Thank you for that. It probably is. I think one of the ways that we try to overcome this was to not just compare to the randomized networks, but also match the two data sets on size. And I didn't really talk too much about it because it gets quite technical there. And I think our collaborator, Erin, would probably be able to speak to that a lot more and how the data sets were matched for sample size. But that's precisely what we tried to do by sort of like bootstrapping the networks to kind of attempt to match them on size, at least for the comparisons purposes. But of course, it's true that perhaps ASL lexicons may be smaller than English lexicons, which have existed for a very long time. And so I definitely agree that there may be some differences due to just the lexicon size. Yes.
Great. I'm going to abuse my position of moderator and jump in with a follow-up question. So a couple of other things occurred to me related to Matt's question about differences that you found that might not just be to do with modality. One is the lexicon size, as Matt mentioned, but another thing could be the fact that you're comparing a language that has a written form and a language that doesn't have a written form, and whether or not that could influence both the lexicon size and also how the lexicon is organized. And another important difference that I think is related to both of the previous factors is the kind of sociolinguistic setting that sign languages tend to exist in compared to spoken languages, and whether that can influence how the lexicon structures itself.
I already forgot the first question, so I'm going to start with the second one. Yes, it's true. I think that there's definitely not just socio linguistic context, but also like developmental context in how how deaf signers acquire sign language, where most of them will acquire it from, the most deaf babies are born to hearing parents, and there may be some really interesting differences in how concepts are preferentially attached in the lexicon right from the onset. So there are definitely some really interesting contextual influences that would be really, really interesting to look into. I think this is kind of just the first step to sort of, take a look at what are the structures like, and then kind of really compels more investigations into exactly that, like the socio-linguistic context, developmental context, and so on. You might need to remind me of your first question. Sorry, Brendan.
The written form.
Oh, yeah.
Effective.
Yes. Yeah. It would be really interesting to look at how, because the small world of words is, I believe it's based on written association, like people type associations. And I'm sure it kind of, again, I'm not sure if it would fundamentally change the structures of the organization, but there may be some really interesting differences. So it would be interesting to compare written associations versus actually when people have to speak the words. That could be an interesting future study.
Great. Okay, let's move on with more questions. Diane, would you like to ask your question? Do you want to turn on your mic and camera?
Sure. Camera. Right. So I was wondering, hi, Zed, thank you for that wonderful talk. It was really informative, and I love to see new work coming out using ASLX and expansions of everything that's going on with that. I find it always an amazing tool for myself. My question is the following. Could the individual parameters like handshake movement, location, trigger effects like you presented for whole signs, like having more local and more extended communities? And I know that it probably wouldn't give you as comparable results with spoken languages because individual phonemes or segments don't do that kind of work in spoken languages. But have you considered looking at these individual parameter communities, and could these in some way substitute or amplify these more local communities that you've already found at the lexical level for ASL?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you so much, Diane. I have so much to say. So I think there's some really cool evidence in Erin Campbell's paper that indeed the communities are not just structured around meaning, but specific phonological components like locations. And kind of that idea of the systematic iconic relationships is really explored in that paper. Because it really shows that the form and the meaning are quite interconnected in sign lexicons. That paper also finds that it does happen in spoken languages to much smaller extent. There is this kind of systematic organization. It's perhaps less iconic, but it does happen in spoken languages like English. We do have another study that I did not mention today that's not really quite being finished or analyzed, but looking at semantic features. And I think that will also be really interesting lens on how signs or concepts in ASL kind of in the featural space, and whether that sort of maybe again clusters around specific parameters for the specific concept. So there's definitely a lot more work to be done, and I think that's a really fascinating question for sure.
Great. So let's move on. The next question is from Robert. And Robert, do you want to sign your question or shall I read it out?
Hello. Oh, I can sign the question. No problem. Oh, wait. Again, amazing presentation. Thank you so much. So much depth, so much information. I really appreciate it. So I was wondering, the short path network, right? The average short path network in ASL. Yeah, maybe you can explain a little bit more about that. How did you define short or not short?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. I think it really is, in this study, it's about comparisons. So comparing the path length against random networks and also comparing the path length against spoken language networks. And I think across the board, we do find that the signed language network tends to require more hops across concepts. So the path length or the average path length tends to be longer in the signed lexicon than in the spoken lexicon. And so we kind of just arrive at that conclusion by making these comparisons. Because I mean, how long is too long or how short is too short? It's really not, I think it's kind of relative. But overall, we do find that there are more hops that you need to make to get from a Q sign to any other sign in the lexicon.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your answer.
Great. So I'm just trying to keep track of everything because we have questions in the chat and in the Q&A session. So Erin has a couple of comments, but I think they're just comments. But Erin, if you want to jump in, please do. And then next, I think it would be, I think it's Tori next. But Tori had her hand up, but I think.
Yes,
Yep,
hello.
Tori.
Yes, hello, and thank you so much for this really amazing presentation. I'm thrilled to finally see some big data going on in sign language analysis, and I'm very excited to see that. One question I had was just more of a broad theoretical question regarding your approach. And as we know, and right, ASL and English are very different in terms of modality, but I just wanted to suggest that both are also different depending on age. And the reason I say that is because we have so many signers today who are signing ASL from compounds, right? And the reason for that is that they didn't have enough semantic depth in whatever signs that were happened to be created. And often we see that resulting in compound signs that eventually are really becoming one over time. And so that would influence the direction, the node density and the hops between nodes. So I'm wondering, of course, because sign language is so much younger than spoken languages in general, how do you account for that age and language in the models? And also, I am wondering about the diachrony, about, all of this ASL and English changes that we've seen over the years. Will we see it become stable at one point? So I wanted to ask about that and also ask you about how you approach using those signers who are, at my guess, would be effectively ASL English bilinguals. How would you make any assumptions about their knowledge of English and how that may impact their knowledge of ASL and vice versa? And what is the word for that in ASL? I don't know, but I just wanted to offer that for the discussion.
Yeah, that's a really excellent, so many excellent points. I do think the point about the diachronic change is really important, and the compounding, and whether that impacts the just the structural organization would be really interesting to look at. I think maybe this gives us the first point in time for some longitudinal analyses. And yeah, the idea that actually, I mean, you're completely correct. These signers are bilingual. They do have an English language lexicons too. And I am sure there will be some structural overlap, and the lexicons will be influencing one another. And I think, it's that's kind of a it's something that it's kind of difficult to find a group of people who would only have one sign lexicon. So that's definitely a factor that needs to be considered, that these structures, these lexicons are in fact bilingual.
Great. Thank you so much. And I look forward to digging into more of this research as it comes out from your program and project. Thank you.
Great. We have the next question from Margaret, from Peggy.
Hi there. Can the interpreter see me? Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. Zed, it was really very inspiring. I've learned a great deal. What I did see is this in this comparison between ASL and English, if a person like myself is from Kenya, or let's say anywhere in the African diaspora, okay, so and has other spoken languages going on in their brain, it lends me to thinking, how do we then do a comparison between, say, somebody who's using English, ASL and English, in that context? Because in Kenya, you can imagine there's like 43 different languages at play. How do you select for people with all this linguistic repertoire going on? I know I've painted a very complex portrait, but I'm interested.
Yes, I I wish I had a clear answer. I'm not sure. Like, multilingualism is a wonderful thing. Um, I think it may be interesting to do something like gather, if possible, gather semantic associations, which is it's a very powerful task. You could gather semantic associations from all these multiple languages, from one speaker, and maybe do some kind of cross language comparisons. So in a way, this approach allows us to do that, comparing across different languages, spoken and signed or spoken. So I think in that sense, that could open up some really interesting um, um, opportunities for comparisons. But I don't really know how you can effectively separate the multiple languages in a person's mind, and using this approach. So I'm open to ideas. I think it's very interesting. And with the world being increasingly more bilingual or multilingual, I think this is it's a valid question.
Thank you.
Great. So time is getting on. So we have one last question asker, Lucas Riffon. I don't know if Lucas wants to ask a question directly. there were two questions from Lucas. I think the first overlaps with Tori's question, so I'm going to skip on to the second question, which is about fingerspelling. So Lucas asks, what is the role of fingerspelling in this network, especially as in ASL? As I understand, Lucas is from Belgium, not from the US. Many signs comprise fingerspelling. So do you think it would make a difference for languages where fingerspelling is less prominent?
That's a really interesting question. Fingerspelling is somewhat prominent in ASL, and I'm sure it's well integrated into the lexicon. We did not look at fingerspelling specifically, and I'm trying to remember in the labeling. So when we actually collected the associations, any fingerspelled responses were probably excluded if they were fully fingerspelled. And that's because in these visualizations, we only retained signs that were in ASLX just because we wanted to do further analyses with this lexicon. So again, the caveat is this, the network analyses, at least these first analyses, are somewhat restricted, or that, smaller than would be. There's a lot more data that we're hoping to analyze and add and expand these lexicons. But I think in these analyses, fingerspelling wasn't prominent. That's not to say that there weren't fingerspelling responses, but that just wouldn't be included in these analyses. So it would be interesting to see how prominent fingerspelled responses are in these tasks, and whether including fingerspelled responses would kind of reshape some of these characteristics. Again, I don't really have an answer, but I think that's a really interesting question. Specifically that, within ASL, there's a lot of fingerspelling. So it would be interesting whether that has more connective properties or more kind of disconnective properties. I don't know. Good question.
Yeah, I think a lot of these questions have been getting at the fact that sign languages have a very close relationship with the spoken language, right? So most of the sign language users also have a lot of knowledge of the spoken language, and even sign language uses aspects of the spoken language in fingerspelling. And so how do these two lexica live with each other, or how do they influence each other? Yeah. That was a great talk. A very interesting discussion session afterwards. So thank you for all the participants for their contributions. Thank you especially to Zed for her inaugural talk in this seminar series. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and especially to Zed for the presentation. So we're going to stop the recording now.